Custom car television runs on noise. Big reveals, loud personalities, and builds time to explode into drama right before the commercial break. That's the formula. And it works because audiences trained on reality television expect it. Iron Resurrection had all of that and genuinely delivered. But underneath the paint and the horsepower and the showmanship, the show carried something that formula-driven automotive television almost never produces. It had a craftsman who wasn't performing. Mike Zabonic never announced himself. He put the welding hood down and went to work. And the strange part is that this made him one of the most talked about figures in the custom car community for years after he stopped appearing on the show. Not because of anything he said, because of what he built, and because of the very deliberate silence he chose when he decided television had taken enough of his time. What followed his disappearance was a fan mystery that outlasted most reality TV controversies, and the answer, when it finally surfaces through the accounts of people who were actually there, turns out to be far more human and far less dramatic than anyone online was willing to accept. Before the Motor Trend cameras arrived, and before Iron Resurrection became appointment viewing for the automotive restoration community, Mike Zabonic already carried serious weight in Texas fabrication circles. Not the kind that comes from a highlight reel, but the kind that accumulates slowly when craftsmen watch each other work and recognize something real. He built his reputation in shops with no interest in being televised, the kind where the floor stays covered in grinding dust and the work either holds or it doesn't, and no amount of editing changes that outcome. Metal fabrication at the level Mike operated required more than technical training, and the custom car world separates people who understand that from people who don't fairly quickly. Working across Texas on restorations and performance builds, he developed a feel for steel that other craftsmen describe in almost sensory terms, knowing how a panel will behave before contact, reading a weld by sound, understanding the tension in a frame section through hands that had spent years getting things wrong before they started getting everything right. Hot rod building at that level is as much instinct as instruction, and instinct only comes from time. Joe Martin recognized this when he was building Martin Brothers Customs into something more than a regional shop. What the operation needed wasn't someone who could be walked through complicated fabrication work. It needed someone who showed up knowing exactly what to do and delivered without friction, and that's what Mike brought every single time. Their working relationship started not with a formal agreement, but with results. One person doing the work so well that the other person stopped looking for alternatives. By the time Iron Resurrection went into production, the partnership had already been tested and confirmed by years of actual collaboration. When the show launched and began building its audience, the vehicles themselves were never really the center of gravity, and that's worth understanding clearly. The cars served as the backdrop. The real engine of the show's appeal was the crew around them, the chemistry of people who had actually spent years in the same shop rather than being assembled by a casting department. Joe Martin's presence at the front, Amanda's role in running the business side, Shorty's paint work, and behind all of it, Mike handling the fabrication and structural work that everything else in each build depended on entirely. Car restoration enthusiasts watching the show started rewinding episodes to study his technique, and that gradual quality is part of what made the appreciation stick. Hot Rod forums developed threads specifically about his approach to framework and welding, and the tone of those threads differed from the celebrity discussion surrounding other cast members. It wasn't admiration, it was respect, which is a harder thing to earn and a different category of response entirely. YouTube comment sections under Iron Resurrection episodes filled with observations from people noting that the structural work was always clean, that the welds on the frames met standards that didn't get discussed on screen but were immediately obvious to anyone with shop experience. The automotive television space had no shortage of personalities who could explain fabrication to a general audience, but Mike was one of the only people on camera at that time who could actually perform it at that level, and the community felt the difference. Instagram pages dedicated to custom car building and metal fabrication would repost clips of him at work and label him the most underrated figure on car television, and the engagement those posts generated came from people who understood why that description was accurate. None of this this translated into the kind of recognition Mike wanted, and that's exactly where the story turns. Reality television builds its structure around production schedules, and production schedules operate on logic that has nothing to do with how skilled work actually gets done. A TIG weld on a custom suspension component takes the time it takes, and reshooting it from 3 camera angles for coverage means the next 20 minutes belong to the crew rather than to the build. Simple jobs got stretched into extended sequences because television needs something to happen, and for a man whose professional identity centered entirely on efficiency and precision, that friction accumulated in ways that didn't surface on screen but were visible to everyone in the shop. People connected to the production describe his withdrawal as gradual rather than sudden, which is a meaningful distinction. Mike started showing up less, taking fewer hours, staying out of shots that weren't necessary for him to be in. No announcement accompanied this. No confrontation developed that required anyone to mediate. He simply pulled back from a system that didn't fit the way he worked, and by the time viewers noticed his absence, the people inside the production had understood what was coming for quite a while. For fabricators and welders who came up in shop culture, where work either speaks for itself or it doesn't, the performance layer that television requires can feel like interference rather than opportunity. Mike never wanted a personal brand built off the show's platform, never pursued endorsements, never positioned himself for the kind of automotive media career the exposure could have opened. The custom car world gave him everything he actually cared about before the cameras arrived, and the cameras complicated that rather than adding to it. That's not bitterness. That's just an accurate accounting of the exchange. Personal considerations accelerated the decision considerably. Family time had been quietly consumed by shooting schedules for years, and the hours didn't improve as the show grew. Health considerations of the kind that don't make headlines but do sharpen a person's sense of what deserves their remaining time pushed the recalibration further. None of this involved conflict with Joe Martin, and the public record on that point is clear. Joe has spoken about Mike with genuine warmth in interviews and podcast appearances, describing him as a brother and a craftsman he'd work alongside again without hesitation, and that framing doesn't come from a situation that ended in resentment. Fan theories online lean toward conflict because that's the vocabulary reality TV gives its audience for understanding cast changes, contract disputes, personal fallouts, buried grievances. The suggestions kept circulating on social media and car forums for months after the season aired without him. What actual accounts from people inside the production describe is considerably simpler. A man who had given the show what he had to give, who received less in return than it cost him personally, and who left on his own terms because those terms were finally available to him again. Back in Texas, Mike returned to exactly the work he had been doing before anyone pointed a camera at him. Private shops, selective custom jobs taken through referral, building for clients who sought him out specifically because of what his fabrication could deliver. No production deadlines imposed from outside the work itself. No reshoots. No pressure to turn craftsmanship into content. The hot rod and custom car community in Texas kept word about his work moving through the right channels, and other builders continued referencing his technique the way craftsmen reference work they consider worth learning from, which is a form of recognition that outlasts any television credit. Joe Martin confirmed in a podcast that Mike was doing well and living exactly the way he chose to, and the phrase attached to that description carries real weight. Off the radar by choice. That's not an apology for someone who faded out, and it's not a consolation framing for an exit that went wrong. That's a description of a clear decision made by someone who understood precisely what they were trading away and decided the trade made sense. Getting that choice back was the entire point of leaving. The legacy Mike Zabonic built on Iron Resurrection doesn't require his continued presence on screen to hold its shape. The early seasons carry his work at a structural level, the frames he fabricated, the bodywork he made right, the foundation under every build that determined what the finished cars actually were. Fans who revisit those episodes still feel the steadiness he brought to the shop, the sense that when something mattered and needed to be done correctly, it was getting done correctly, and that impression doesn't dissolve because the person who created it moved on to somewhere better. What this story ultimately reflects about the custom car world and automotive television as a genre is something the fabrication community has always understood, but the screen tends to obscure. The most consequential person in any restoration build is not always the one delivering the narrative narration or closing the dramatic arc. Sometimes the person the whole thing depends on is the one working without commentary, without applause, and without any interest in being the version of themselves the camera wants to find. Mike was that person on Iron Resurrection, and he remains that person now, somewhere in a Texas shop with a welding torch in hand, doing the work the way it should be done and asking nothing from it except the right to keep doing it exactly that way.